Hi, sixth grade. So this is your first set of video notes that you're going to be taking with me. And so I want to give a brief little explanation of how video notes work. I go at a regular pace and I don't stop for you to take your notes. So whenever you need to stop and take time to write or type the notes down that you're seeing on my screen, you can just pause the video and do that. Feel free to record if you need to hear something a second time. You are not allowed to listen to the video on mute. Many times I will pull up the screen and you might just see the notes and think that that's all there is to it, but there's also some discussion that goes along with it. So we will review this in class, but hopefully this will help us so that we don't have to take the time to stop and write everything down and we can just do more practice together. So you guys can at this time go ahead and you can either decide to take your notes on paper or typing, and we talked in class about some of the different tips that I had for how to play the video and take your notes at the same time. So please kind of think back to that conversation. But we are going to start talking about variables. And so the first I can statement that I have for you guys is actually that I can define the term variable. And we're going to be working again with all about talking about lab investigations. So a variable is any factor that can change. And when we're looking in those investigations, there's going to be many things that we can change. If you think back when we did our investigation, when we were working with observations and inferences, we had 3 white powders. Each powder was a different substance. That was one variable that was changed. And an experiment usually has 3 kinds of variables: independent, dependent, and controlled. You're going to need to know the definition for each one of those types of variables. So if we're looking at an example here, the time it takes to run a kilometer depends on the amount of exercise a person gets. I want you guys to take a moment and you can either write practice in your notes or you can go to a separate sheet of paper. I want you to think about what are the things that are going to be changing in this scenario. So take a moment, pause the video, and answer that question, and then come back when you're ready. But I'm going to keep moving on. So the time it takes to run a kilometer depends on the amount of exercise a person gets. Well, one thing that I know in a lot of you runners, each runner is going to run a kilometer in a different amount of time. So one of the variables is going to be the amount of time, and then the second variable would be the amount of exercise. Okay, so let's do one more practice. The higher the temperature of water, the faster an egg will cook. So you pause the video, write down your answers. You should see temperature of water, that's one thing that we can change. And the time for the egg to cook is another thing that we can change. You should be noticing kind of one thing about the last 2 scenarios with our variables. And that would be that both of these, our variables are always measurable. So I can measure the temperature of the water, I can measure the time that it took to cook, I can measure the time it took to run a kilometer, and I can measure the amount of exercise, how many minutes I'm exercising, how many times a week I'm exercising. So we'll do more practice activities like this in class where we're just identifying the variables. If this is confusing to you, that's okay. We'll talk about it. But I do kind of want to move on and just get a few more notes with our variables. So in a good experiment, the independent and dependent variables are both measurable. I'm giving you some examples of what's measurable: time, mass, length, and distance. Bad variables to use would be love, success, passion, and hardworking. So let's go ahead then. I mentioned the independent and dependent variables. Let's talk about what those are. The independent variable is the variable that's changed by the scientist on purpose. So a good, fair test only has one independent variable. Go ahead and pause your video if you need to take this notes, but I'm going to continue on. We're going to skip this practice, but this is one question that we're going to do in class, identifying the independent variable. The dependent variables, those are what changes because of the independent variable. So this really is going to depend on the independent variable. That's how it gets its name. You can kind of think about this as like the cause and the effect. If the independent variable is the cause, the dependent variable is the effect. So it's the effect caused by the independent variable. These are usually the things that we're observing, and these are the things that we're measuring in our investigations. So let's do one example together, identifying the independent and the dependent variables. So the longer the amount of time spent studying causes an increase in test scores. So I want you to actually write this example word for word down in your notes, and then I want you to see if you can identify the independent and the dependent. So when you're reading this, I want you to pick out what's the thing that I as the scientist would be changing on purpose. So first I'm going to kind of figure out those two variables. The first thing that I see that I'm measuring is the amount of time studying and then my test score. So now I'm going to see, what am I changing on purpose? Am I changing my test score on purpose, or am I changing the time spent studying? I'm changing the time spent studying. That's the thing that I want to kind of test or experiment on. Then what's being affected by the time spent studying? What do I think that's going to change? Well, I think what's going to change is my test scores. So that's going to be my dependent variable. Okay, so that's just one practice, and this is just a brief introduction to independent and dependent variables, but I did want you to go ahead and get these notes down, and then we'll talk more about it in class. The last type of variable that we're going to talk about are controlled variables. These are the parts of the lab a scientist wants to remain constant or the same. There's usually more than one controlled variable, and we might also call these the constant variables. So with an independent and dependent variable, we only have one independent variable and we only have one dependent variable. But then there's a lot of things that we need to keep the same in order to make sure that we're not having anything else affect our dependent variables. So if we look at this example here, how will the type of fertilizer affect the growth of a pumpkin plant? Well, plant 1 gets manure, plant 2 gets Miracle-Gro, plant 3 gets compost, and plant 4 gets nothing added. The things that I want to control, I want all of the plants to get the same amount of water, the same amount of sunlight, and be in the same location, because the thing that I'm testing is the type of fertilizer. So I want to know exactly just those things that are going to be affecting the growth of the pumpkin. If my pumpkin plants were getting different amounts of water and different types of fertilizers, I wouldn't know what variable was actually affecting the growth of a pumpkin. So it's kind of like we're isolating our plants, and we have to make sure that everything stays the same except for one thing. And that one thing that we change to our plants or to our test subjects in an experiment, that's going to be the independent variable. So I always like to think of that I, it also kind of looks like a 1. So one independent variable, and then we have to start listing and brainstorming all of those other things that we need to keep the same. So we'll talk more about independent, dependent, and controlled variables. We will do a lot of practice. If you're confused, don't freak out on me right now. I know it's a lot of information, but we'll probably spend at least a week, if not more, practicing these and doing a lot of labs with independent and dependent controlled variables. So you guys are finished with your notes. Make sure that those notes get put back into your science binder because we'll be reviewing them next in class.